Thank you, Stephen. Former SABC interim board members have briefed the media today. They were responding to the Special Investigative Unit's report, which found evidence of irregularities in the awarding of a multi-million rand security tender in 2017. The tender was given to Mafoko Security Patrols, despite another company, MJAYELI, reportedly scoring higher during the bidding process. In the report, the SIU said it will approach the court to try and recoup monies lost due to the contract from the implicated board members. The former interim board members have denied any wrongdoing.
By the time the interim board came in, the bid execution committee, the BEC, on this particular security tender had already been constituted and had processed the security tender for Auckland Park and recommended them to MJAYELI should be appointed. The three companies were actually presented to the board, but MJAYELI and Mafoko scored 99% and 98.87% respectively. MJAYELI's tender was for 183 million rands over 5 years, and Mafoko was for 185 million for the same period.
The company that was at that time providing security, which was called Venus, its contract had expired more than 2 to 3 years, I think. And it had been extended as they were tendering, and MJAYELI was not making it. The tendering process would be aborted, and then Venus' contract would be extended. So we were told, legally, you can no longer extend Venus. So you have to make a decision here and now. And we were sitting there with this information from the whistleblower, and the fact that if we don't make any decision, we would be left in a few days' time with an SABC without security.
So that's former SABC board member Matata Zedu. Former SABC board chair Khanyisile Kweyama joins us now, together with former SABC interim board member Krish. Naidoo, a very good evening and welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you, SABC.
Let me start with you, Ms. Kweyama. You raised concerns about the report being leaked. Let's talk about that. Who do you think was behind that, and to what end?
Well, your guess is as good as ours, but clearly somebody who wants to cast aspersions on the interim
So when
board.
did you learn that it was leaked? Has the SIU never come back to you to give you some sort of preliminary report, or even saying we are releasing the final report, but this is what the content thereof?
No. In a few days ago, actually, that's when the SABC board chair, Mr. Makatini, sent the report to us and said specifically it was very confidential. So we definitely did not expect to see it in the media space, and none of us have any interest in putting it into the media space.
What has been the effect of that, Mr. Naidoo, of leaking the report? Because again, I go back to to what end do you think that this was done?
Well, starting first with the SIU Act. I mean, the Act says very specifically that only the President shall see this report, no one else. Now, I'm not sure whether the President has seen this yet and made up his mind whether he must just, not ignore it or act on it. I'm not sure whether that has happened. But notwithstanding that, this report was sent to us, and I raised this matter with the SIU head and with the chairman of the board. I said, look, I'd like to know, and I wrote to them and I said, I'd like to know, how did this report get into the public domain? And I'm still waiting for both of them to respond.
Okay.
Now, the effect, as you wanted to know, is that, I mean, it's very disparaging to our character, our good name and reputation, and our dignity. And that's why we are here today, to fight for these things. That's what we fought for the last 50 years in this country.
Well, let's get to the crux of the matter, some of the allegations that have been made. So you're rejecting it on the basis of some of the allegations made by the SIU, saying that you, as the interim board, overruled some of the SABC's procurement or supply chain processes. You reject this. So
it's beyond allegations, because the SIU has made rulings. One of those rulings is that we should be referred for criminal prosecution. Another is that we should be referred for
declared as delinquent.
Declared as delinquent directors. So those are the two things that we are rejecting. I mean, in order for you to be declared a delinquent director, Krish can tell you the conditions that must exist, one of them being willful misconduct, corruption. In the same report, the SIU has said, because there were allegations of corruption, implying that we gave the tender to Mafoko because money had exchanged hands and all that. And
so
they
we'll
investigated that and said there was no corruption.
Okay, and I'll get to some of the alleged whistleblowers as well.
Yes.
But I want to talk about the report that has come out saying that MJAYELI Security scored higher and was even 2 million rand less, but yet Mafoko won the tender. What was the rationale behind not overhauling the whole process? Because I understand that you were raising security concerns as well, that tender documents may have been tampered with.
So part of the reason, and Krish can also pitch in, part of the reason of not cancelling and starting from scratch, as you heard Mr. Tsedu saying during the day, was that it had already been cancelled 3 or 4 times. And in the allegations that we received, the reason was so that the preferred bidder should come up and be number 1.
And did you suspect that would be MJAYELI? Because I understand that you said, you've said that the tender in question had been withdrawn twice after MJAYELI had failed to meet the requirements.
Yes.
These tenders go back, I've been on this board since 2013 amongst these 5 board members. These tenders go back to about 2014, 2015. And even the previous tender around security at the SABC was hotly disputed by the contenders at that time. So there's a history of contestation around these tenders. So there's nothing unusual that happened here, except that in this case we came fresh from a parliamentary inquiry which said go in there and fix up the rot at the SABC. And that's exactly the mindset that we came to.
So among the concerns that were raised is that the safe where the tender documents had been kept was opened without the chairperson and any of the bid committee members being present. What does that imply?
First, it's not the chairperson, it's the supply chain manager.
Okay.
And at the time, there was an acting supply chain manager, and that person had not been present. So there are certain people that have to be there. You know, it's a standard operating procedure.
So what is the suspicion of what could have happened in the interim?
Well, there were quite a few issues beside the one issue that you mentioned. The second issue was we called for the scorecards of the bid evaluation committee, and there were changes and error corrections, etc., particularly to give a particular bidder an advantage. And as non-executive directors, we had a fiduciary duty to question that quite thoroughly. You know,
when you say to give a particular bidder advantage, had you already drawn a conclusion as to which bidder it was?
No. When we looked at these scorecards and we asked for the scorecards and all the other related documentation around this was at not at the board meeting, but a previous meeting where we sit, the two of us, as non-executive directors or board members of a subcommittee of the board, and we were not fully satisfied with the responses getting from management, so we called for documentation, because as non-executive directors we are expected to apply our minds properly and fully to the matter before us.
So we had the axed head of supply chain management, Simon Mlaudzi, and the former SABC GM of supply chain governance, Ayanda Mkhize, who apparently claimed at the time that they were fired on trumped-up charges because they knew too much about the alleged impropriety around the security tender. What was the reason behind this, should I say, perceived whistleblowing?
We should first start by saying that when Ayanda Mkhize and Mlaudzi were fired, we were no longer here. So if we had an interest in getting them out of the system, we should have done it while we were still here. So when they were on TV, we actually had to, our lawyer had to come in from outside to come and respond to that. And one of the things that, one of the findings in the SIU report was that the BEC had been improperly constituted.
Yes.
And they were on the BEC. They were the people in supply chain who were constituting the BEC and did not follow the process properly. So I don't know who's trumping who, because when all that happened and the BEC was formed, we were not even members of the board.
So you say that when you made the decision that you are following it on the basis of legal advice, and I'm wondering, why would you have to do that if you have supply chain process in place and that is airtight? And the second question is probably linked to that. Did you know who the owners of these two companies were if interference was then inferred?
So we got legal advice because there had been whistleblowing allegations that said that the supply chain management process had been interfered with. So when you say it was intact, it was not intact. The allegations were saying it has been fiddled with.
Were there findings to that effect?
That is not in the SIU report, which is another area that we are questioning. Because as soon as we heard about these whistleblowing allegations, we knew who it was because the people approached me and we took it to the SIU and said, these allegations have been made. You are the people that are competent to investigate this. Investigate. We got initial feedback that, oh, there was nothing to the allegations. So the board said, but these people have said A, B, C, D, and they've even referred you to somebody who was in the first phase and the second phase. And there was nothing of that. And it still doesn't appear in the report, which is a big problem.
Just to answer your question about legal advice, I think that was a responsible approach in the sense that we found sufficient grounds to deviate from the preference given to us by management. And then we approached the head of legal at SABC and said, look, we've got this conundrum now. From our assessment as fiduciary responsibility as non-executive directors, we believe that we should give it to the second party and not the first. What is our legal
So
options?
during this whole time, Mr. Naidoo, there were allegations as to who some of the owners of these two companies were and why they would have the political muscle or whatever social standing to interfere with the tender process. Did you ever find out who those owners are?
I don't know these.
Was it ever important?
Yeah.
We've checked, I've Googled to see if it's anyone that I know. I don't know them.
Yeah, I don't know them.
Never
also.
met
I've never
them,
met
don't know
them.
Okay, so you are taking the report on review and you're arguing that there are certain legal factual inaccuracies. What specifically?
Well, I mean, firstly, I mean, as Khanyisile pointed out, it appears as if the current board initiated the discussion, which is not true. Our board, the interim board, started this way back in 2017. We specifically called on the SIU to initiate a investigation around the security tender. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, this report says that as the interim board, we should have waited for the subcommittee to report. In other words, we jumped the gun as a board. And that's not true also. And I've actually brought the minutes of those two meetings. And I was just said this afternoon in the previous interview, if you read these two sets of minutes where the security tender was discussed exhaustively by an interim committee of the board and a subcommittee of the board. Now, if the SABC is committed to good governance, good corporate governance and transparency, these minutes should be released to the public so that the public can understand whether the five of us acted properly or not. And if the SABC is not prepared to do that, I would like to get one of the NGOs like Media Monitoring Africa or somebody to bring an application in terms of the promotion of access to Justice Act and compel the SABC to make these minutes public. So then the entire country can be satisfied whether we acted properly or not.
So, Ms. Kweyama, just finally, the concerns you had about the process leading up to the appointment of the service provider, you explained your role in it, but the final outcome, is that something that you're also going to be materially questioning in the findings that the SIU has made?
Well, you know, I think even from a lay perspective, I'd like to understand what information you decide is useful or is not useful to go into a report. Because if you are investigating that the security tender is award, then you should look at all the factors that fed into that, including the ones that we gave to you and said, This is what people are alleging. If you are going to find that a BEC was improperly constituted, then you must find out why it was improperly constituted. Why were people selected that would sit around the table, and those that should have been there that were not there, that were excluded from the process? So all those things should be taken into consideration before you make a ruling. And from what we are perceiving is that it's almost as if it was just about the board and nothing else.
So
and
you would encourage the current board to release the report, even though I know you said that it has to be before the president, he himself has to release.
That's what the law says. The SIU Act says only the president of the country must see a report.
But now that process
but somebody must explain from the SABC or the SIU, how did this document become public?
What is the interest in making it public?
Yeah. Now that should they officially release it now that the horse is already bolted?
No, I think you all should be speaking to the president and say, have you considered this report? Because it's now gone into a court process, this report, and the question then is, how is the court going to deal with it? It's a confidential document, you see, so it's all those legal complications I don't think has been thought through carefully by whoever released this report.
Right, and hopefully we will get some sort of response from the presidency. Thank you very much, former SABC board members Khanyisile, Kweyama and Mr. Krish.